Sign this, or pack your things and leave with nothing, my daughter-in-law said, her voice smooth and practiced, as if she had rehearsed those words long before my husband was even gone. And for a moment, I simply looked at the paper in front of me, the neat lines of legal language swimming slightly as the weight of everything settled quietly into my chest. Not sharp, not loud, just heavy, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. Because it had only been 3 days since Edward was buried. 3 days since I had stood beside a polished oak casket under a gray sky, gripping a tissue that had long since gone dry. 3 days since people had hugged me and whispered how strong I was. And now here I was, sitting in a leather chair that wasn't mine, across a polished conference table that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, with a stranger in a suit and my own son staring down at his hands while his wife decided what would become of me. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask a question. I simply folded my hands in my lap and listened as the lawyer, Mr. Klein, he had introduced himself, cleared his throat, and began explaining the document as if it were routine, as if widows signed away their homes every day between appointments, as if 37 years of marriage could be reduced to a few paragraphs and a signature line. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, confident. One leg crossed neatly over the other, and I noticed the small details I might have ignored before. The way she tapped her finger lightly against the folder, the way her eyes flicked toward Daniel to make sure he stayed silent, the way she smiled. Not kindly, not warmly, but with a certainty that told me she believed this moment was already decided. Daniel shifted slightly, his shoulders tense, but he still didn't look at me. And that, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. Because my son had always been many things, stubborn, ambitious, sometimes distant, but never this quiet, never this absent. And I realized then that whatever conversation had led to this had not happened in front of me. It had been built slowly, carefully, in rooms I was no longer invited into. I reached forward and touched the edge of the document, just enough to steady it, just enough to show I was present. And for a brief second Rebecca's smile tightened, just slightly, as if she had expected resistance and didn't quite know what to do with my silence. The room felt too still, the kind of stillness that hums beneath the surface, and I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere behind me, marking time in a way that suddenly felt very deliberate, very final. Mr. Klein continued speaking, outlining terms, conditions, transitions, words like transfer and relocation drifting through the air, but I wasn't really listening anymore. Not to him. Not to Rebecca, not even to the quiet breathing of my own son, because something had shifted, something small but certain, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that this moment was not the end they thought it was. It was only the moment they believed they had already won, and I let my hand rest calmly on the paper, my expression unchanged, my voice steady when I finally spoke. Of course, I said softly, as if I were agreeing, as if I were exactly who they believed me to be. And that was the first mistake they made. 48 hours earlier, the house had still felt like mine, not in the legal sense that lawyers like to discuss, but in the quiet, lived-in way that comes from decades of small routines, of knowing exactly which floorboard would creak near the hallway, and how the afternoon light would fall across the kitchen table around 3 o'clock. I remember standing at the sink that morning, my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had long since gone cold, watching a thin layer of frost melt slowly off the backyard fence as the sun came up, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe that everything, despite the loss, would somehow settle into a new kind of normal, that grief would be the hardest part and the rest would simply follow. Rebecca had come in early that day, earlier than she ever used to, her heels clicking lightly against the hardwood floor as she set her purse down with a careful precision that now feels almost deliberate in my memory. She had smiled at me, that same polished smile she wore in front of guests, and asked if I had slept at all, her voice soft, almost concerned, and I remember nodding even though I had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between breaths, trying to adjust to the silence Edward had left behind. Daniel followed shortly after, his tie slightly crooked, his movements distracted, and he kissed my cheek quickly before stepping away as if there were somewhere else he needed to be. Even though he had nowhere to go that morning, we sat at the table together, the three of us, and Rebecca poured coffee into matching cups, as if we were still a family sharing something ordinary, something intact. She spoke about small things at first, about paperwork that needed to be organized, about calls that had to be made, about how overwhelming everything must feel for me, and I listened, grateful in a distant way that someone seemed to be taking charge of the details I did not have the energy to face. But there was something underneath her words, something I could not quite name at the time, a steadiness that did not match the situation, as if she had already moved past the morning and into something more structured, more purposeful. I remember her reaching for a folder that she had placed neatly beside her chair, sliding it closer to Daniel, her fingers brushing his lightly, and he looked at her, not at me, before giving a small nod that felt rehearsed. That was the first moment something in me shifted. Not enough to alarm me, not enough to make me question openly, but enough to plant a quiet unease that settled somewhere just beneath my ribs. The rest of the day passed in a blur of polite conversations and controlled movements. Rebecca making calls in the next room, her voice lowered but firm. Daniel stepping outside more than once to answer messages he did not explain. And me moving through the house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, touching things out of habit, straightening objects that did not need straightening, trying to hold on to a sense of place that was already beginning to slip. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the house grew dim, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom Edward and I had shared for so many years, looking at the neatly folded blankets, the reading glasses still resting on the nightstand, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air, and I remember thinking that grief was supposed to feel louder than this, sharper, more consuming. But instead it felt quiet and distant, as if something else was already taking its place, something colder, something I could not yet fully see. And when Rebecca called out from the living room, her voice carrying just enough urgency to pull me away, I turned without hesitation, still believing, still trusting, still unaware that the ground beneath me had already begun to shift in ways I would only understand too late, or so they thought. I began to notice the changes in the smallest details, the kind most people would dismiss as nothing. But when you have lived in a place for nearly 4 decades, nothing is ever just nothing. It started with the study, Edward's study, a room that had always been left untouched by anyone but him. The desk still arranged the way he preferred, every pen aligned, every document stacked with quiet precision. And yet that afternoon I found Rebecca standing inside it, not hesitating, not asking, simply opening drawers as if she had every right to be there. She looked up when she saw me, her expression calm, almost pleasant, and said she was just trying to organize things, to help. And I nodded, because that is what I had always done. I had always trusted, always believed that help came without conditions. But something in the way she closed the drawer, quickly, deliberately, stayed with me long after I walked away. Later that evening, I noticed Daniel in the hallway speaking in a low voice on his phone, his back turned toward me, his words clipped and careful. And when he realized I was there, he ended the call immediately, offering a brief explanation about work that did not quite fit the hour or the tone. I did not question him. I simply watched as he moved past me, avoiding my eyes, and that quiet avoidance felt heavier than any argument could have been. The next morning, the first real shift revealed itself. I went to open the small safe in our bedroom, the one Edward had shown me years ago, the one he had insisted I should always know how to access, and the code I had used for over a decade no longer worked. I stood there longer than I should have, entering the numbers again, slower this time, as if the problem might be my memory rather than the lock. But the result was the same, a soft mechanical refusal that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the room. When I asked Rebecca about it later, she did not seem surprised. She simply explained that she had updated some of the security settings, that it was for the best, that things needed to be managed properly now. Her tone polite, reasonable, almost reassuring, and yet she never once asked if I agreed, never once paused to consider that it might have been my place to decide. Daniel sat nearby while she spoke, nodding faintly, reinforcing her words without adding his own, and I realized then that decisions were being made around me, not with me, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together forming something far more deliberate, far more controlled. I began to pay closer attention to the folders Rebecca carried from room to room, to the way she kept her phone angled away when she typed messages, to the quiet rhythm of conversations that stopped the moment I entered a space. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a thought I had been avoiding, that this was not simply organization, not simply concern. This was preparation, careful, methodical preparation, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that whatever was coming had already been set in motion long before I ever realized I needed to ask questions. So I stopped asking. I stopped offering suggestions. I stopped correcting small things that felt wrong. And instead I listened. I watched. I learned the shape of their silence. Because something told me that understanding would matter more than reacting, and that the answers I needed were already there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to finally see them for what they truly were. I did not confront them, not that day, not the next, because the truth is I had spent most of my life believing that love was proven through patience, through understanding, through giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when something inside me whispered that I should not. And standing there in the quiet of that house, watching it slowly change shape around me, I found myself reaching backward instead of forward, back to the years when Edward was still here, when nothing in this place felt uncertain or borrowed. I could still see him at the kitchen table in the early mornings, reading the newspaper with his glasses low on his nose, tapping his finger lightly against the wood whenever he came across something he disagreed with. He had always been a man of quiet habits, predictable in the ways that made life feel steady, and yet he was never careless, never inattentive, especially when it came to me. I remembered the way he used to say, almost casually, that everything we built was ours, not his, not mine, ours, as if the distinction mattered more than anything written on paper. And I remembered the afternoon, years ago, when he had sat me down in that same study Rebecca now moved through so freely, showing me where he kept important documents, explaining things in a calm, methodical way, insisting that I understand every detail, even when I told him I trusted him enough not to need it. He had smiled then, that quiet, knowing smile, and said that trust was not a substitute for knowledge, that one day I might need to stand on my own. Understanding, not just my faith in him. At the time I had laughed softly, brushing it off as unnecessary, because I could not imagine a world where he would not be there to guide me, to protect what we had created together. But standing in that same house now, hearing Rebecca's voice echo through rooms that once held his, I began to see those memories differently, not as comfort, but as instruction I had failed to fully absorb. I walked through the hallway slowly that evening, letting my fingers trace along the edges of framed photographs, moments frozen in time where everything looked whole, birthdays, holidays, quiet weekends where nothing remarkable had happened except that we had been together, and I realized that Edward had not only built a life with me, he had prepared me for a time when I might have to defend it. Even if I had not understood that at the moment he tried to teach me, the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that he would never have left things in a state that could be so easily taken, that he would never have trusted anyone, not even family, to handle everything without safeguards. That certainty settled into me slowly, replacing the confusion that had clouded my thoughts since his passing. And for the first time since I had sat in that office with Rebecca and Daniel, I felt something steady return, not hope, not yet, but clarity, a quiet awareness that there were pieces missing from the story they were presenting, pieces that I had not yet seen but that had to exist, because Edward had never been careless, and neither, I realized, could I afford to be anymore. I did not go looking for answers right away, not in a dramatic way, not with confrontation or accusation, because I had learned something important in those quiet hours of remembering, that rushing would only show my hand, and whatever Rebecca was doing, she had planned it carefully, which meant I needed to be even more careful in return, so I moved slowly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed, as if I had accepted everything exactly as it had been presented to me. I made my coffee the same way each morning. I sat in the same chair by the window. I listened when Rebecca spoke about arrangements and timelines, nodding gently, asking just enough questions to appear involved, but never enough to seem suspicious. And in doing so, I began to notice more than I had before, small inconsistencies that did not align with the story she and Daniel had created. It started with a phone call, one that came late in the afternoon while Rebecca was out and Daniel was upstairs. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up, and the voice on the other end introduced himself as Thomas Green from the bank, his tone polite but hesitant, as if he was unsure whether he should be calling at all. He asked if I had received the documents Edward had arranged before his passing, and for a moment I said nothing, because no one had mentioned any documents beyond what Rebecca had shown me. I told him carefully that I was not sure what he meant, and there was a pause, a brief silence that carried more weight than his words had, before he continued, explaining that Edward had made specific arrangements regarding certain accounts and property protections, that there were instructions meant to be delivered directly to me, not through intermediaries, and that he had been trying to confirm receipt for several days. I felt something shift inside me then. Not shock, not exactly, but a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect, that there was more to this than I had been told. I thanked him calmly, asked him to resend whatever had been intended for me, and ended the call with the same steady tone I had used throughout. But when I set the phone down, my hands lingered on it just a moment longer than usual, as if grounding myself in the reality that was slowly coming into focus. That evening I watched Rebecca more closely, the way she moved through the house with increasing confidence, the way she spoke about future plans as if they were already secured, the way Daniel followed her lead without question, and I realized that whatever documents Edward had arranged, she either did not know about them or believed they would never reach me, which meant she had built her certainty on incomplete information, and that, I understood, was where her control could begin to unravel. I went to the study later that night, closing the door softly behind me, standing in the dim light with a sense of purpose that had been missing before. I did not search frantically. I did not open every drawer. Instead, I looked carefully, remembering how Edward had organized things, how he had always separated what was visible from what was important, and for the first time since all of this began, I was not reacting to what they were doing. I was following something he had already set in motion, something meant for me to find. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the house that no longer felt quite as uncertain, I understood that the story Rebecca had written for me was only one version of the truth, and it was not the one that would last. I did not tell anyone about the call, not Daniel, not Rebecca, because the moment I heard the hesitation in that man's voice, I understood that whatever Edward had arranged had been meant for me alone, not to be filtered, not to be explained away, and certainly not to be controlled by someone else. So I waited. I carried on with the quiet routine they had come to expect from me, moving through the house with measured steps, speaking only when spoken to, letting Rebecca believe that her version of events had settled into place without resistance. And in that stillness, I created space for the truth to arrive. It came the next morning, not with urgency, not with drama, but with the soft, ordinary sound of the front door opening to receive the mail. I walked to the hallway as I always did, collecting the envelopes with the same calm motion. But this time my eyes lingered a moment longer, scanning each name, each return address, until I saw it. A plain envelope, unremarkable at first glance, but addressed directly to me in a careful, professional hand. I turned it over slowly, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but deliberate, and I did not open it right away. Instead, I carried it with me into the kitchen, setting it down beside my coffee, allowing myself a moment to breathe, to steady the quiet shift happening inside me, because I already knew, before breaking the seal, that this was something Rebecca had not intended for me to see. When I finally unfolded the contents, the language was clear, precise, unmistakable. Edward had established protections, layers of them, accounts that required my direct authorization, property clauses that prevented transfer without my consent, instructions that could not be overridden by any secondary party. And as I read each line, slowly, carefully, the narrative I had been given began to unravel, not violently, not all at once, but with a quiet certainty that replaced confusion with understanding. This was not oversight. This was not miscommunication. This was omission, intentional and calculated. I sat there for a long time, the paper resting in my hands, the morning light stretching across the table in a way that felt almost unchanged from any other day. And yet everything had shifted. I was no longer trying to make sense of their actions. I was seeing them for what they were, incomplete truths presented as final decisions. I folded the document neatly, placing it back into the envelope with the same care Edward had taken when preparing it. and I did not rush to act, because acting too soon would only alert them, would only give Rebecca the chance to adjust, to adapt, and that was something I could not allow. Instead, I placed the envelope in a drawer that only I used, hidden in plain sight among things no one else had reason to touch, and I returned to the rhythm of the house as if nothing had changed. Rebecca spoke to me that afternoon about timelines again, about how it would be best for everyone if things moved forward quickly, her tone gentle but firm, and I listened, nodding softly, offering no resistance, giving her exactly what she expected, compliance without question, and in doing so I saw the confidence in her settle even deeper. She believed she had control, she believed the outcome was already secured, and that belief made her careless in ways she did not yet realize. Daniel remained quiet, following her lead as he had before, his silence now something I no longer tried to interpret, because understanding him would not change what needed to be done. I had spent days feeling as though I was being pushed out of my own life. But sitting there, listening to her speak as if the future had already been decided, I realized something far more important. I had never actually lost my place. I had only been made to believe I had, and belief, I understood now, could be corrected, quietly, carefully, and at exactly the right moment. I understood then that the most powerful thing I could do was nothing, not the kind of nothing that comes from fear or confusion, but the kind that is chosen, deliberate, controlled. So I began to step back in ways that were subtle enough to go unnoticed. I stopped asking about the paperwork entirely. I stopped entering the study unless I had a clear reason. I let Rebecca move freely through the house without interruption, and in doing so, I gave her exactly what she believed she had already taken: authority, space, control. She responded to it almost immediately. Her movements became more confident, less cautious. She no longer lowered her voice when speaking on the phone, no longer paused when discussing plans in front of me, and I could see it in the way she carried herself. The quiet satisfaction of someone who believes the outcome is already secured. Daniel followed the same pattern, his discomfort fading into a kind of practiced normalcy, as if the tension that had once existed had been resolved simply because I had stopped reacting to it. And that was when I began to understand just how much of their certainty depended on my silence, meaning surrender, which made it all the more important that they continued to believe exactly that. I adjusted my routine carefully, making small changes that appeared incidental but were anything but. I began organizing my own documents, not in obvious ways, but gradually, quietly, removing what mattered from places they could access and placing it somewhere only I would think to look. I made a few phone calls of my own, brief, measured conversations that did not draw attention, confirming details, asking questions without revealing what I already knew, and each answer I received added another layer to the picture that was forming. A picture that made it clear that Edward had not only protected me, he had anticipated exactly this kind of situation. That realization did not bring anger, not in the way one might expect. It brought clarity, a steady, grounded awareness that replaced the uncertainty I had been living in. And with that clarity came patience. I no longer felt the need to rush, no longer felt the urge to confront or correct, because I understood that timing would determine everything. One evening, as Rebecca outlined another step in what she referred to as the transition, her tone calm and assured, I nodded again, offering a small, almost grateful smile, and I saw the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her confidence deepened just a little more. She believed I had accepted my place in the story she had written, and that belief made her predictable. It made her transparent in ways she would never have allowed if she thought I was watching closely. Daniel glanced at me briefly during that conversation, a flicker of something uncertain passing through his expression, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by the same quiet compliance he had shown from the beginning. And I realized then that whatever doubt he might have had was no longer strong enough to change anything. Not for him, and not for me. I finished my tea slowly that night, listening as Rebecca spoke about dates and arrangements as if they were already set in stone, and I let her words settle into the room without resistance. Because resistance would have changed the dynamic. It would have forced her to defend, to adjust, and I needed her exactly as she was, confident, certain, unguarded. When I stood and excused myself, my movements calm, my expression unchanged, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me. Not anger, not fear, but intention clear and unwavering. Because for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing for what would happen next, and they had no idea that the quiet they mistook for defeat was the very thing that would undo everything they believed they had already secured. The pressure did not come all at once. It built slowly, deliberately, the way everything else in this house had been unfolding. Rebecca began to introduce deadlines, not harshly, not with raised voices, but with a calm certainty that made them feel less like suggestions and more like inevitabilities. She would mention them casually over breakfast, while setting down a plate or pouring coffee, speaking about moving timelines forward, about how it would be easier for everyone if decisions were finalized sooner rather than later. And each time she spoke, she watched me carefully, not in an obvious way, but enough to measure whether I would resist, whether I would question, and each time I gave her the same response, a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing that would disrupt the version of me she had come to rely on. Daniel became more direct in those moments, not confrontational, but firmer than before, repeating her points, reinforcing the idea that this was practical, necessary, the best outcome for all of us. His voice carried a rehearsed steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if he had convinced himself that agreement was easier than doubt. And I listened, the same way I had been listening all along, without interruption, without emotion, allowing their words to fill the space while I observed the rhythm of their certainty. The house itself began to reflect their intentions, small changes appearing one after another, boxes arriving and being left in the hallway, labeled neatly, as if my departure had already been scheduled, drawers being cleared in rooms I had not agreed to vacate, conversations about furniture being repurposed, reorganized, reassigned, all spoken in front of me as if I were no longer part of the decisions. And still I did not object. I did not question, because each step they took revealed more than any answer they could have given me. It showed how far they were willing to go, how completely they believed they had control. One afternoon, Rebecca placed a folder in front of me, similar to the one I had seen before, but thinner, more specific. She explained that it was simply a formality, a final confirmation to streamline everything, her tone patient, reassuring, as if she were guiding me through something complicated for my own benefit. And I looked at it briefly, not reading, not yet, just enough to acknowledge its presence, before setting it aside with a calm that seemed to satisfy her. She did not press, she did not insist, because she believed time was already working in her favor. Daniel watched that exchange closely, his expression tightening for just a moment, as if something in him hesitated, but once again he said nothing, allowing her to lead, allowing the moment to pass without challenge. And in that silence I saw clearly what I had only sensed before, that whatever remained of his doubt was no longer strong enough to alter the path they had chosen. That evening I walked through the house alone, the quiet deeper than it had ever felt, not empty, but expectant, as if everything around me was waiting for something to happen. I paused in each room, not out of sentiment, but out of recognition, understanding now that nothing here had actually been taken from me. Not yet, not in the way they believed, because ownership is not determined by what someone claims, but by what can be proven, and I already knew that proof existed, safely where they could not see it. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, listening to the faint sound of Rebecca's voice in the other room, discussing plans with a confidence that bordered on certainty, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible pause, a moment to acknowledge how completely she believed in the outcome she had created, before setting the glass down and turning away, my steps quiet, measured, unchanged, because the more certain she became, the less careful she would be. And that was exactly what I needed, for her to continue, for her to move forward without hesitation, without doubt, until the moment arrived when everything she had built would no longer hold, and by then, it would already be too late for her to change it. I chose the moment carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that timing was the difference between being heard and being dismissed, and Rebecca had grown so comfortable, so assured in her version of events, that she no longer questioned anything that appeared to align with her expectations. So when I told her the next morning that I was ready to finalize everything, that I wanted to move forward with the paperwork she had prepared, I saw the satisfaction settle into her expression almost immediately, subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders relaxed, her tone softened just slightly, as if she were finally dealing with someone reasonable, someone who had accepted what needed to be done. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in days, searching for something he could not quite define, but I held his gaze only briefly before looking away, giving him nothing to question, nothing to hold on to. Rebecca moved quickly after that, arranging another meeting with Mr. Klein, speaking in efficient, confident terms about bringing everything to a close, about ensuring that all documents would be signed properly, that there would be no delays, no complications, and I agreed to every suggestion, every timeline, every detail, because agreement, I had learned, was the easiest way to move unseen. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, and when we arrived at the office, everything felt almost identical to the first time. The same polished table, the same controlled atmosphere, the same quiet expectation that I would simply follow the path that had been laid out for me. Mr. Klein greeted us with a professional nod, already prepared, already confident in the outcome he believed was about to take place. Rebecca sat beside him this time, closer than before, as if proximity itself reinforced her authority, while Daniel remained slightly behind, his presence steady but passive, and I took my seat across from them, placing my hands calmly on the table, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral. The documents were presented again, more refined, more specific, each page marked with tabs, each section carefully highlighted to guide me through what Rebecca had described as a simple process. I picked up the pen when it was offered, holding it lightly between my fingers, not hesitating, not questioning, and for a moment the room settled into a quiet certainty, as if everything had aligned exactly as they had planned, but I did not sign. Instead, I placed the pen down gently beside the document and reached into my bag, not hurried, not dramatic, just a simple movement that shifted the air in the room in a way none of them immediately understood. I took out the envelope I had received, the one addressed to me, the one they had not accounted for, and placed it on the table with the same calm precision I had used for everything else. Rebecca's expression changed first, not drastically, just a slight tightening around her eyes, a brief flicker of uncertainty that she tried to mask with composure. Mr. Klein glanced at the envelope, then at me, his professional confidence faltering just enough to suggest that something was no longer following the expected script. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening, and I finally allowed myself to speak, my voice even, controlled, carrying none of the emotion they might have anticipated. I explained that before signing anything, I believed it was important for everyone to review all relevant documents, not just the ones prepared recently, but those that had been arranged prior, those that reflected the full intent of what Edward had put in place. I slid the envelope toward Mr. Klein, watching as he opened it, his eyes moving across the pages, his expression shifting in small, controlled increments that told me more than any words could have. Rebecca remained still, her composure intact but strained, as if she were waiting for a detail that would restore her certainty. But it did not come, because the more he read, the clearer it became that the story she had relied on was incomplete, and that incompleteness had consequences. I sat back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, not pressing, not insisting, because I did not need to. The truth was already there, unfolding in front of them, line by line, and for the first time since all of this began, the silence in the room no longer belonged to me. Mr. Klein did not speak immediately, and that silence, measured and professional, carried more weight than any objection Rebecca might have raised. His eyes moved slowly across the pages again, more carefully this time, as if confirming what he had already understood, and when he finally looked up, the certainty that had defined his earlier tone was gone, replaced by something far more cautious, more deliberate. He adjusted his posture slightly, placing the documents flat on the table as though they required a different level of attention now, and for a brief moment no one else moved. Rebecca remained composed, but I could see it in the way her fingers tightened around the edge of her folder, the way her shoulders held just a fraction too still, as if she were bracing for something she had not anticipated. Daniel shifted beside her, his gaze moving between the papers and my face, searching for an explanation that was no longer being offered to him directly. Mr. Klein cleared his throat softly before speaking, his words chosen with care, explaining that the documents presented in the envelope introduced provisions that had not been reflected in the materials he had been working from, provisions that required direct authorization from me for any transfer of property or financial control. And as he spoke, I watched Rebecca closely, not for a reaction, but for the absence of one, because true surprise does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in the smallest hesitation, the slightest delay before composure returns. She responded quickly, too quickly, suggesting that there must be some misunderstanding, that perhaps these documents had been superseded or misinterpreted, her voice steady but carrying a faint edge that had not been there before. Mr. Klein did not immediately agree. Instead, he returned to the pages, pointing out specific clauses, language that was precise and difficult to dismiss. Language that made it clear that what had been presented to me earlier was not the full picture. Daniel leaned forward then, his attention no longer passive, asking questions that had gone unspoken before, his voice uncertain, almost cautious, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar ground. And for the first time since all of this began, the dynamic in the room shifted away from Rebecca's control, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in a subtle redistribution of certainty. I remained silent through most of it, allowing the conversation to unfold without interruption, because this was not a moment that required force, it required presence, the simple act of being there, of allowing the truth to speak through the documents Edward had prepared, was enough. When I did speak, it was only to clarify that I had not received these materials until recently, that I had been operating under the understanding provided to me by others, and that I believed it was only appropriate that everything be reviewed in full before any decisions were finalized. My tone calm, measured, leaving no room for accusation, no opening for conflict. Rebecca's composure began to tighten around the edges, her confidence no longer as fluid as it had been. She attempted to redirect the conversation, to suggest that timelines still needed to be honored, that practical considerations remained unchanged, but her words no longer carried the same weight, because the foundation beneath them had shifted. Mr. Klein acknowledged this carefully, stating that additional review would be necessary, that proceeding without reconciling these discrepancies would not be advisable. And that statement, simple as it was, marked the moment everything began to change. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression no longer fixed, no longer certain, and I saw in him the first real sign of recognition, not of what Rebecca had intended, but of what had been missing from what he had been told. I folded my hands gently on the table, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because nothing about this moment required me to claim victory or demand acknowledgement. The truth had already begun to do that on its own, and as the room settled into a new kind of silence, one that no longer excluded me, but included me fully, I understood that what they had believed to be the end of my place in this story was only the point where it began to return to me. The meeting did not end the way Rebecca had expected, and I could see it in the way she gathered her things afterward, each movement controlled, but slightly sharper than before, as if precision could restore the certainty that had slipped from her grasp. Mr. Klein spoke in measured terms about needing time to review everything properly, about ensuring that all documents aligned before any further action could be taken, and those words, simple as they sounded, carried a finality that could not be easily redirected. Rebecca nodded, agreeing outwardly, but there was a tension beneath her composure now, a quiet urgency that had replaced her earlier confidence. Daniel remained silent as we left the office, walking beside us without speaking, his expression distant, as though he were replaying the conversation in his mind, searching for where things had shifted. The drive home was quiet. Not the heavy silence of conflict, but something more uncertain, something unsettled. And when we arrived, Rebecca moved ahead of us, her steps quicker than usual, disappearing into the house without waiting. Daniel paused at the doorway, his hand resting briefly on the frame, as if he needed a moment before stepping inside. He turned to me then, finally meeting my eyes in a way he had avoided for days. There was something in his expression I recognized, not quite guilt, not quite understanding, but something in between, something that suggested the beginning of awareness. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, and after a moment he simply nodded, a small, uncertain gesture, before following Rebecca inside. I did not press him. I did not ask what he was thinking, because whatever realization was forming in him needed to come without my influence. It needed to settle on its own. The house felt different when I stepped inside, not because anything had physically changed, but because the illusion that had surrounded it had begun to dissolve. Rebecca was already in the study, her voice low but tense as she spoke on the phone. The door partially closed, her words indistinct but her tone unmistakable, controlled but strained. I passed by without pausing, without acknowledging, moving through the space as I always had, but with a clarity that had not been there before. Later that evening, she approached me again, her demeanor carefully adjusted, her voice softer, more measured. She spoke about needing to clarify a few things, about how situations like this could become complicated, about how it would be best if we all remained cooperative, and I listened, the same way I had listened from the beginning, calmly, without interruption, offering nothing that would escalate the moment, because escalation was no longer necessary. She was no longer in control of the narrative in the way she had been, and she knew it, even if she would not say it aloud. Daniel stayed in the background during that conversation, quieter than before, his presence no longer reinforcing hers, but simply existing alongside it. And that shift, small as it might have seemed, was enough. I finished my tea slowly, setting the cup down with the same steady motion I had practiced for days, and I met her gaze briefly, not with challenge, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to counter, certainty, because I was no longer questioning what was happening. I was no longer trying to understand their version of events. I had already seen beyond it, and that knowledge required no explanation. The rest of the evening passed without further discussion, the house settling into a quiet that felt less oppressive and more defined, as if each room had returned to its rightful place. And when I finally went to bed, I did not lie awake counting the seconds in the silence. I rested, knowing that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumptions or omissions, but by what had already been put in place long before any of this began. And for the first time since Edward was gone, I did not feel like I was being pushed out of my own life. I felt like I was standing firmly within it once again. The days that followed did not erupt into confrontation or dramatic resolution. They settled instead into something far quieter, far more definitive. Mr. Klein's office contacted us within a week, requesting a follow-up meeting to review the findings after examining all documents in full. And when we returned, the tone was different from the beginning. There was no assumption this time, no quiet expectation that I would simply agree and comply. Everything was laid out clearly, carefully, with a level of detail that left no room for interpretation. Edward's arrangements had been thorough, intentional, and legally binding in ways that could not be bypassed or redirected. The house remained under my control, the accounts required my authorization, and any attempt to transfer ownership without that consent would not stand. The words were not emotional, they were not accusatory, but they carried a weight that settled into the room with quiet finality. Rebecca sat very still as they were, explained, her expression composed but distant, as if she were listening from somewhere just beyond the table. Daniel leaned forward again, asking questions this time not to reinforce her position, but to understand what had actually been put in place, and I answered when necessary, simply, directly, without embellishment, because nothing needed to be added to what was already written. When the meeting concluded, there was no argument, no raised voices, only an understanding that what had been assumed was no longer valid, that what had been presented as inevitable had been undone by something far more solid than opinion or persuasion. We returned home in the same quiet that had followed the previous meeting, but it was no longer uncertain. It was resolved, defined. Rebecca moved through the house differently now, not with the same easy confidence, but with a careful distance, as if each step required more thought than before. She no longer spoke about timelines or transitions. Those conversations had simply stopped. Daniel spoke to me that evening, not with apologies, not with explanations, but with a hesitance that suggested he was still finding his place within a reality that had shifted beyond what he had expected. I listened, the same way I had listened all along. But this time there was no need to search for meaning beneath his words, because what mattered had already been decided. The house felt like mine again, not because anything had changed physically, But because the uncertainty that had been placed around it had been removed, I walked through each room with a quiet awareness, not of loss, but of presence, of continuity, of something that had never actually left me, only been obscured for a time. Later that night, I stood by the window, looking out at the backyard where Edward had once spent hours tending to small details most people would never notice. And I understood then that what he had given me was not just protection, it was clarity, the ability to stand still while everything around me shifted, to wait until the truth revealed itself without forcing it. And as I turned away from the glass, the house settling into its familiar silence around me, I did not feel the need to reclaim anything, because nothing had truly been taken. I had simply allowed others to believe it had, and that belief, as it turned out, had been the only thing they ever really held. I let them think I had nothing left, and that was the moment they lost everything they thought they had gained.